Okay, we're live. I'm speaking today with Monica Gagliano. Monica, for those who don't know you, can you say a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Hello. Well, I'm a research associate professor in evolutionary ecology at the University of Western Australia, and I'm also a research associate for the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. And soon I will be just moving permanently to Sydney, so joining the School of Life and Environmental Science.
Oh, wow, congratulations. That's pretty exciting. You're an Australian you're native Australian?
Well, who is native Australian? I was born in Italy, and I did my, I guess, university training a little bit all over the place, mostly in the UK actually. But
Oh.
I did my PhD in Australia, and when I landed in Australia, I thought, oh, this is my home. So then I stayed, and yeah, and I've been very lucky to be able to become an Australian citizen and feel like I am Australian.
Oh,
So
very cool. Yeah, I guess I misunderstood that. Sorry about that. But
that's all right.
you've had a very interesting career path. So you started doing fish work with fish. And you describe in the book, by the way, your new book is very exciting, very interesting. Thus Spoke the Plant. I mean, this is a very exciting read. And I'm sure you're looking forward to it coming out, I guess, in November, right?
Yep.
But you describe your experience as a researcher doing fish ecology and then why you suddenly stopped doing that. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what happened exactly.
Yeah, well, as you pointed out correctly, I trained as a marine scientist, and all the way, my undergrads were in marine biology and oceanography in the beginning, and I did a master in marine science and fisheries. And I guess because at the time I always wanted to do something with the ocean, and at the time I wanted to save the world. And so I thought if I do, if I learn about how fisheries work, I might be able to do something in that area. And then I realized that actually I wasn't very interested in the economics of it, and fishery involves a lot of that, and I was more interested in actually how things work in nature. And so then I went on and did I worked in different labs around the world as a research assistant for a while, because I thought that PhDs is for very smart people. And I'm not for that. I'm not cut for that. And so I did a lot of research assistant work for a while, and then while I was doing that, I was helping someone else doing their PhDs, and I thought, wait a second, I can do this for myself. So then I went to James Cook University, which is pretty much the best university in the world for tropical marine science. And I was very lucky. I was able to do my PhD as an ecology. I was always in the field, and my field sites were on a little island called Lizard Island, which is in the middle of the Great Barrier Reef.
Wow.
So yeah, I had a very spectacular PhD time, because I was in the water in these places where, the typical place that you see from a postcard with the little palm tree on the golden beach and the crystal waters. That was my
Sounds
PhD
nice.
lab.
And so
So,
this involved like underwater work? You were scuba or?
yeah. I spent a lot of time, and I spent more time underwater than on the surface, I would
Wow.
say, for that amount of period of time during my PhD. I was in the field for at least 3 or 4 months of the year, sometimes even more. So, and when I was in the field, I was in the water all day, every day. And so I had a really intimate connection, I guess, with the area and with the species that I was working with, and that is actually, it was my fish, the species that I was working with, that gave me the big lesson that I needed to learn and change not only my career but also my personal life, I guess, because I was doing these experiments, looking at the effect of parental stress, so how mom experienced the environment, including the social environment during reproduction, and see how that would translate into what happened to the next generation, so the babies. And and so as part of that study, I was in the water, as I said, every day, looking at these fish, which are wild animals, doing their thing, like on the reef. And of course, I had my little tags to know, like, oh, this is mom and dad number 1, 2. And I had like something, I was chasing something like 80 different individuals. So I had a nice samples. And in the process of that experiment, well, you know, at the first, during the first week at least, these fish, being wild animals, are not exactly interested in you. If anything, they're quite scared of you. And but after a week of seeing me coming every day and just like passing through and checking out and then going without really doing anything disruptive, I could put my hand out and these fish will come in my hand, and I could close my hand around them, and they would just be like, yep, this is Monica, she comes every day and it's all good, you know. And so there was this really quite personal relationship, although I speak of it now like this, but at the time I just thought like, oh, these are just fish, these are my sample, these are going to be my data point, and this is how I was trained, and this is how I saw them. And so it was a little bit of a shock, I guess, to my system, both the conceptual system as well as my personal perspective, to see that these fish actually were about to teach me something that I didn't expect. And that was on the last day of the experiment. So after 3 or 4 months of this interaction, very close and personal, I went in the water that last day in the morning, and the idea was to collect all the fish that day. And because, you know, people maybe doesn't realize, but a lot of animal science, not all of it, but a lot of animal science involves the killing of the animal at the end, because we need to take the brain sample or the gonad sample or the liver sample, some samples of some sort that requires like the body parts. And I was totally fine with that. With a little bit of shame, I can say that I killed a lot of animals for my science until that point, and it's sanctioned. We got ethics permits for that. You know, like it's all good, and that's how we are trained, and that's how we train.
Right.
And then, but that day, so I thought, okay, I want to go and have one last swim around to say goodbye to my fish, and then in the afternoon I'll come and collect them all for my samples. And so that morning I went like every other morning, and well, at least I thought I was like every other morning. And I didn't have any nets or anything that was suspicious from the perspective of the fish. But the fish knew, and nobody came out. Everyone was just hiding in the little holes, and I was like peering in to see, and they were like looking at me like, you know, this is not good news. Monica today is not good news. And in that moment, I don't know, something broke down, something beautiful, I think, broke down. And it was this this realization that, well, the fish knows. The fish knows what I'm up to. And I don't know how he knows, but he definitely knows. And he's showing me this. And not only that, but he's showing me that he knows about me and what I'm thinking better than I know myself, because I think that I can just go in there and think that, you know, it's okay to think I'm going to kill you all this afternoon and they won't know. And instead they did. And that really, I just, it was shocking because I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what was going on. And what I learned later, it took me 10 years to actually share this story, because I felt very ashamed, and especially I didn't know how to fit it within the context of the science. You know, it's like, well, you know, you're supposed to just do it and you're not supposed to feel anything. And actually we are trained to be, we call it objectivity. I have lots of problems now with this word, but you know, we think that to be objective, it means that you are detached from your object of observation. But what I learned is like, there is no such a thing as an object of observation. So the objectivity is not about how you connect with your study species, but it's more how you apply the methods of science, which is objective. And but that came later, and I guess later I understood that when looking at the literature from conservation psychology, I understood that when we are faced with a really big shock or a big task that we feel overwhelmed, and that felt like that to me, we are not very good at being creative with our mind. Actually, literally, I think our brain shuts down and we can't really think of alternative possibilities. The thing is that we just go and do what we already know. And what I already knew was, well, you just collect the fish and you take them. And so in the afternoon, I went back and I did that. But it was the last time I killed, and of course that started a bit of a crisis. And in the midst of this crisis, I tried to carry on my fish science by not killing the animals. But it was becoming very difficult to publish the work because the scientific establishment is set in a way that is expecting you to have those body parts and the samples associated to it. And so in that moment, I think I just moved from Queensland, where I was doing my research, to Western Australia. And because we were in a new home, I was setting up the garden and just planting. I think I was planting basil plants or something like, very common. And while I was planting, it really dawned to me that it's like, I don't have to work with fish. I have, I can do it maybe some other ways. And then literally just felt like the plants that I was planting felt like they said something like, why don't you work with us? You can take leaves and we are not going to die. And, why don't you work with us? And I was like, as this process was starting, it was like, I don't know anything about plants. And I was like, don't worry, we'll teach you, And so it kind of started literally as an experiment. It's like, okay, how do you transform this into something else? And in a way, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it really not only changed my approach to science and the actual, both the ontology and the epistemology of my science, but also it allowed me to really understand what it means to experiment, to be truly experimenting with whatever is presented and truly finding knowledge or exploring knowledge through experimentation, which involves, of course, the prime subject, yourself. So that's how I got to plants.
Yeah, that's a really interesting story. I mean, I've worked in a lab before. My own background's in neuroscience and cognitive science, and I had to work with rats. So I certainly have had a similar experience. That's why I sort of switched to psychology instead of neuroscience, was for much the same reason. I think a lot of people in the labs, they deal with it in different ways. The sacrificing of the animal. And the weirdest thing, especially with the rats, is that you have to go and handle them when they're babies to get them to trust you. So it's this really weird experience of petting them and getting familiar with them, and then later, chopping them up. So it's. But you're absolutely right that the science requires it. It's really hard to do the science without doing that. So I teach neuroscience, and this is one of the hard things to communicate to the students, is like the science is pretty brutal. And whether it's worth it or not is a subjective assessment, the ethics of it all. But anyway, sorry for that rambling. I really admire, though, your resolve to try something completely new and something that you weren't trained in. So So how was it, the switching over? Was it, the same kind of scientific methodology in general is applied, but working with plants, a completely different arena. So how was it getting grants and being in that other world?
Well, honestly, I just moved to Western Australia for a new project on brain and in fish. And that was the fellowship that I had when this happened. And of course, as you can imagine, you can't study the brain of a fish without actually pulling the brain out and doing things like that. And so that project never really happened, because it was just like, I'm not doing this. I can't do this. And I just sneakingly started doing my experiment with plants without telling anyone, and just like, this is what I'm doing. And then, we'll see what happens. And the worst that can happen is that they say that, oh, you're not performing, you're not doing the right thing, and we're kicking you out. I was like, okay. But in the meantime, I'll try this and see how it goes. And if it works, then I'm sure the university won't care if I worked on fish or plants. It's like, at the end, the university just care that you're doing something cool that is gonna, advance knowledge and whatever else, publish the papers and whatever else. So I thought, okay, well, here is the gamble. So let's try and see what happens. I know that I cannot do my fish science the way in which is required. So that's it. So either I get out of science now, or I try something different. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't work, well, I was going to get out anyway. So maybe it's just a delay. And but I guess it really felt like I say it now because of course in hindsight it's easy, but I think the plants saved me as the scientist, because if those experiments didn't work out, and there was a really high chance that it didn't work out because I didn't really know anything, still don't really know anything about plants, and so it was always a gamble. And but they did, and the first experiment that I did was actually quite simple conceptually, not so simple to run because of course that's the thing, is like to translate some of the frameworks that we use for animal research into plants is not that simple. Conceptually yes, but when you're actually doing it in practical terms, what you would do with an animal is quite different. Of course you have different issues in terms of like movements and that kind of stuff. And so that was an interesting exercise for me. And what I did, the first thing I did, of course, as probably any scientist would do, I went into the literature and see like, okay, so what do they know about like information exchange, communication, or any of this stuff in plants? Because that's really what I was interested already in the animal field. So I was like, okay, so what's there? Is there anything? And I was surprised, pleasantly surprised that actually there was already stuff there, and the experiments, some of them were beautiful. And like when you see those neat studies, it's like, yes, this is really good science. So it got me kind of excited, and also I felt, oh, I think maybe I can do this. So and the first study that I did was inspired by my own garden, and so I used chilies, basil plants, and fennel plants. And at the time, because I was getting into gardening and I was reading a lot about like how to make your garden thrive, and all the entire literature on companion gardening, and so plants, they do go well together, and plants, they really don't like each other. And so I thought, oh, I wonder if I can use that concept and see where the channels that we know plants use to communicate with each other. And at the time, it was primarily light, the chemical volatiles, and touch. And so I thought, okay, what happens if I create a setup which experimentally excludes one of them or all of them at the same time? And so the idea was like, well, it will show me which one are maybe the prioritizing channels, but also will show me whether there is something else beyond those that we haven't explored. And that's exactly what I found. It's like that I had these crazy boxes, look like matryoshka boxes set up, and which took a lot of work and a lot of effort to maintain. And when people see the paper, they only see the final results. As you know, it'd be like, oh, isn't it neat? And it's like, yeah, it takes a lot of, I don't want to do that experiment ever again. But yeah, what it showed was like that even when you block all of the channels that we know plants use to communicate, they still know who is growing next to them. And so that opened up for me another question, which is always the case with science. You do the experiment, then you go more questions than answers. But and it was okay, how do plants know who is next to them if we are excluding the channels that we already know they're using? So there obviously must be other channels. And this is, again, coming from the animal background, was really useful because, of course, in animal science, in animal ecology, sound is one of the things that we look a lot to. And so it's like sound is everywhere. Whether you're an animal, a plant, a bacteria, surely sound, you're affected. It's always present. And so that kind of started me in this trail of like, okay, I wonder if plants use sound. And then, of course, I bumped into the sort of pseudoscience, folkloristic aspect of this story where, in the 60s, science, or apparently scientists have said that, like plants like music and all of that. You can see now that, at the time, maybe it was useful because maybe it was coming at a time in history where those kind of conversations were really needed to bring the attention back to nature. But then if we look at it now, we can really appreciate that the idea were probably good, but the approach was not so good. And so, the infamous The Secret Life of Plant, which is like, it's a nightmare for anybody that does any of this work now, because people assume that that's what you're doing, and it's like, it is not what we are doing. Unfortunately, those studies were, as I said, maybe the ideas were good, but the approach was non-scientific, really, because it cannot be replicated. The methodology is not explained enough to be able to even try to replicate this stuff. So, and besides, you know, when you're talking about sound in specific, is like, well, sound and music are two different things, you know. Music is a very human concept, and it's a, you know, it's a way in which we appreciate certain sounds put together in a particular way that makes, you know, pleasing effects or not to us. But that has got nothing to do with sound as the sound in the environment or the frequencies that are available to animals, plants, or whatever. And I was, of course, I was interested, and I am interested in that rather than the music. I receive a lot of emails. Oh, we want to play music to our plants. It's like, yeah, go ahead. But not with me. I'm not really interested. I'm sure your plants likes Mozart better than Beethoven. I heard this story too, but it's got nothing to do with this. So what I was really interested in was more than this sort of pseudoscientific area. I was really interested and intrigued by the literature from anthropology, where you see a lot of indigenous engaged in the relationship between the human and the plant in terms of sound, and they do speak of songs, which either the elder or the shaman or whoever is singing to the plant, or even more intriguing is the plant singing to them, and then they are kind of the medium or the translator of that information. And in many cultures, those songs are used to then heal the people, call the rain, and all sorts of practices. And that has been in the literature and it's been in our culture as humanity for a long time. So, you know, the secret life of plants is kind of a new thing, really, in the context of the time scale. And it doesn't really, I'm not really interested. But this, on the anthropological aspect of the story, very interested. And so I started exploring myself. And, you know, I mean, the true method of knowledge is experimentation, right? William Blake. So that's what I did. Is like, okay, so if I need to work out whether this is got any legs, I need to go and find out myself. And in a way, this is where then this book comes in. It's like it's been, you know, it's kind of behind the scenes, because of course this kind of conversation is not I commonly have with my colleagues.
Right.
And actually it took me a very long time to have this conversation at all, because as you can imagine, it can freak some people out. And it can, you know, it can be easily dismissed as like, oh, she's just gone loopy. But I'm not loopy at all. I'm very grounded, and I am a scientist, and I think that's part of my job is to explore and experiment. And if that means going to the edges of what we know, which I think that's what science should do, then I'll go there.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, because this book has details of the science that you did, but also your personal experiences, talking to the shaman, using psychedelic drugs, vision quests. I mean, there's quite personal details related in that respect. So it wasn't until you started doing the research though that happened. So you started with the basil and the chili peppers, and then you went to South America, was it?
Yeah, it's been like as I started engaging with the research, this material started appearing, because of course I was searching. And then as it started appearing and I engaged with the material, more ideas arrived and more material arrived. And so it became like a tandem. And then I realized, like as the year went by, I realized that this was all part of my science. So I'm a field ecologist, right? And I was really frustrated in a way that a lot of my science with the plants was stuck in the lab. And of course, it needed to be, because we're just opening these areas and you can't go in the field unless you know what you're trying to look for. And but my desire has always been to go back in the field. You know, that's where I want to do the science, because that's where things are really happening. In the lab, I can construct things and make them, you know, whatever I want, really, in terms of environment, while the real environment is the dynamic one, the one that is got all of the noise and the variation, and that's really the juice. So But then I realized only literally recently, as I was talking to someone else about the book, and I realized, oh, that was my fieldwork. Like my fieldwork was, I didn't know at the time, but my fieldwork was about sourcing knowledge and experiencing directly the environment where some of these ideas have emerged, and see for myself what does it mean and what happened when you do engage with those spaces. And of course, I totally understand that. You know, some people would probably think that they're just like, oh, she just went off and she was tripping and all of that. But it's actually that sounds to me such an understatement, because what emerged from there is the science that I eventually actually did, and the science is not in question. It's been, you know, reviewed, published. I know that I've done it. If anything, with my plant work, I've done more replication and more strict protocols than I've ever done before, because I knew that it was like, well, you want to really make sure that whatever you're claiming is really actually happening and not some, you know, wishful thinking or any of that kind of stuff. So yeah, so it's gonna be tricky. I mean, I'm very curious to see how people respond to that.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how. I mean, I agree with you that it's really easy to dismiss some of the things that you're saying, because you're saying, well, I took this, you know, ayahuasca and then had the experience of speaking to the plant. But then on the other hand, and many people have not had that experience, I would hazard. But on the other hand, you describe, you know, having the experience of thinking up an experimental design under those conditions and then carrying out the experiment. And the data that's collected seems like good data. So whatever your view is about what happened on those hallucinogenic journeys you had, the result was good science. And so I don't think you can argue with that at all.
And the interesting thing, I guess, is like that before people jump onto the judgment wagon, they should check, because, well, either you check yourself, you know, if you want, if you're so curious and if you're so adamant about judging this as dismissing it, then first go and try yourself and have the experience so that you know what you're talking about. But of course, not everyone can, not everyone should. I'm not, you know, I'm not encouraging people to go in the middle of the jungle and drink ayahuasca or any of that, because actually it's pretty hardcore. So,
Yes.
you know, but the other thing though that they could be easily check and is the history of science, and not just science, but the arts and all sorts of other explorations that humans have done forever. It's like there's been the involvement of some otherworldly kind of experiences. I don't even know myself as to describe them really, and I found it really difficult to write a book in that context, because I don't really know. I know the experience that I had, but I don't really know what the real words or the most appropriate words would be to describe those experiences, because I know that our society is kind of like, it's really committed to a particular intellectual space. You know, it's a Western space, and anything that kind of shifts a little bit on each side, it's uncomfortable and it's easily pushed away. But just because, you know, it feels threatening to the space that we are comfortable in. So, but if you look into the science of, you know, anyone really that made anything, any contribution that was worthwhile, a lot of these people had some kind of experiences that we would define as otherworldly, whether they involved, you know, plants or other like mushroom as well, or simply like a connection and being deeply connected to nature. You know, people that went off and, you know, they spent time in nature, in solitude, and people, I mean, Darwin himself is like, he was the greatest observer of nature. That's how he did it. But, you know, he needed to really, when you read his work, you can see that he really needed to be putting himself in the roots of plants, in the shoes of plants, to really appreciate what a plant might be looking for, searching for, being attentive to. And so these need to put yourself in the shoes of another, or in the roots of another, or whatever it is, it's really what these you know, these experiences kind of mediate. And then how you get there, it doesn't really matter. And in fact, what I learned through my experiences is that whether it is one of the most potent hallucinogenic on the planet, the ayahuasca, or whether it's a vision quest which involves no drugs, it's just your own drug. You're there, solitude.
Extreme stress of the system.
Exactly. That it really it kind of cracks open that intellectual framework that you are encased in, and it allows you for a little moment to see something else. And then of course, we have this idea that hallucinations is got a bad connotation, but it's if you are hallucinating because you are physically sick, that's a one story. But if you're actually bringing your mind into that space to explore something else, I think that there is an intent there. There is a very conscious effort to get there. So the hallucination doesn't take you and sweeps you away and makes you non-functional in this world. It actually, if anything, I find it made me even more functional here, in the sense that I feel I can make an even more important contribution for being able to see something a little wider.
Right. And it is important to note that a lot of these experiences you had were under the guidance of people who knew what they were doing. You weren't
totally
by yourself. Yeah. I mean, and I agree with what you're saying. I think I'm someone who thinks that hallucinogenics are good for people, that everyone should try it at least once. I've experimented with a lot of these myself, not for science like you have, just for recreation. And I think that the breaking open the sort of traditional viewpoint that you have, seeing another viewpoint, whatever you make of it, that's a different question. Yes. But seeing things from a completely different angle is worthwhile and beneficial. So I think your honesty in this book is also admirable, that you come right out and say, these are the experiences I had, make of it what you will. But also the results, I think, are really interesting as well.
Yeah.
I would have been pretty nervous if I were you, right?
Yeah, well, it took, there were a lot of, there's been plenty of bouts of anxiety in the process of writing the book. And of course, I was talking to a colleague just a few days ago, and I was like, I don't understand, some people is gonna be really upset about this book because it is a scientist writing it. But if I was an anthropologist, if I was a philosopher, if I was an artist, there would be no question, no problem.
Yeah.
I've been reading the new Michael Pollan's book, which is amazing. I really love his work, and I love him, and great. But it's everyone is, of course, he's an amazing writer, and everyone is really honoring this book. I'm like, yes, the new Michael Pollan, amazing work, which it is, But that's what he's talking about. He went off and went and explored for himself some of these experiences to work out and make up his mind. And he's quite a staunch materialist, really, or was. And I guess through the process of this book, he was allowed to see something else and kind of, open up his vision. So I'm interested to see, because, of course, science has this role still, more or less, in our society as a Western culture of defining the world, right? So if science says so, it must be true, and all of that. And so for a scientist to write this, is threatening certain perspectives. And that's why I think the book in itself, I felt it was kind of a duty to my science to write it. And of course, I know that it might compromise some spaces, and some people might not want to have anything to do with me, just in case. But that already was happening when I was doing the science and the study stories. So for me, it's not going to really change much. Right. And if anything, I just feel, well, the way in which I see my work in general, it's very much from an ecological perspective. And what I mean by that is that, for me, things emerge in the interaction and relationship and in the relating of things. And so I just wrote the book, but the book in itself doesn't exist as such until the reader comes in. So then there is the reader and the writer meeting through the emergence of the book. So each one, I'm perceiving it in a particular way, and the reader will perceive it in another way. And really, the book is somewhere in between the two. And so for me, from that perspective, then I'm just part of a picture. And whatever the other side of the picture is gonna create in terms of relationship between me and the reader through the book, it's interesting no matter what happens. And really, it's actually exactly what I see happening in nature, So I see as this is yet another experiment.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how it works out. And
Yeah.
I think it's going to be very interesting because there's some people will be threatened by it, but I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm not threatened by these sorts of things. So
Good.
I am, I have to. So I do come from a more like staunchly materialistic framework. Just to put my cards on the table. I'm open-minded about alternatives, but I think that a lot of them, I sort of want to take the position that a lot of this stuff can be explained in terms of neural functioning. And really, I would want to have that ruled out before I was forced to some other position. And I'm not saying that couldn't happen, but I certainly am a bit skeptical about some of the metaphysical implications, although not skeptical all about the usefulness of the experiences and those sorts of things. So I am kind of curious about what your ultimate kind of position on the nature of reality is after all of this. So you position yourself as someone who's kind of against materialism or questioning it in a sense. And I wonder if that was like how you felt before, or is that a product of the experiences that you've had, or where are you on that question?
I don't think I'm against anything, but certainly questioning. But I'm questioning as well the metaphysical, alternative, I guess. So I'm just, I think that what I've learned through these experiences in the last 10 years of this research is that, well, definitely I know less than what I think I know. And that should be always my starting point. Yes. And so because I don't know, then all I can do is open myself to the experience of knowing. And as I said, for me as a scientist, experimentation is the way in which I approach the world. But and again, going back to the objectivity of the science, is like I find that science is definitely a way that I find it very useful in the way in which I can express myself in the world through that science method. So, and that is objective. It's got certain rules. I know what the rules are, and I can follow them, and I have no problem with that. But at the same time, I don't think that science, as the essence of science, is.
Sorry, you just broke up for a second. You don't think the essence of science is what?
Is exclusively an objective endeavor. And so, and I was trained to think that way. And so in that sense, I'm breaking down for myself. I'm breaking down the materialistic aspect of science for me, because I know now that, well, no, there is other things that can play. And at this stage, I don't understand them. As you said, we might find a neurological base for it or not. Great. But so I'm just open to questioning rather than, so even with the book, it's like whatever I've written in the book, I'm happy, and I want to live myself. I want the freedom to change my mind about all of it.
That's a good scientific attitude.
But, this is what it is. What it was actually in the moment in which I wrote it. This is where I was at. But I already know, because I had other, of course, like since then I had already other experiences. I met other people. I've had other conversations. And again, in this relational space that I think reality really is, for me, some of the understanding that I got already has changed. And some new stuff has arrived. Some other stuff is gone. So I'm happy to, I'm happy to be this open system, because again, I think that's how nature really works. It's an open system that keeps changing and flowing and fluctuating, and that's how evolution works as well. Like if you didn't have the variation in the system, it would just stay the same, but that's not the case. So
yeah. Yeah, I guess the reason that I was asking was because some of the things, so a lot of the way that you see your work described is as finding that plants have a mind without a brain.
Yeah.
And so, and in the book, you explicitly say that you're not really interested in the mechanics of answering the question, how do they do the things that they do? Leave that to the plant physiologists or whatever.
Yeah. They're much better at the job than me. That's why.
But so I would guess I was asking because to kind of get around that kind of not willingness to answer. I mean, it's got to be. So I was curious: do you think that these plants are able to do these things because they have some non-physical attributes, or is that just something you have no interest in talking about?
No, I'm happy to talk about it. Like, first of all, I should say that it's not that I'm not interested in the mechanics because I don't think that they are important or are interesting. It's just that I know that that's not my area of expertise. So I'm not interested in the sense like, don't ask me to do this because that's not what I'm good at. And that's why I say the physiologists are really good at this. And it's the same as saying, like you can have a behavioral ecologist that works on zebras, but really, unless he's got a neuroscience background, it shouldn't really fiddle with the brain of the zebra, or trying to work out. So it's the same. It's like I'm not a plant physiologist, so I'm really comfortable in looking at the behavioral responses and how that is expressed. And of course, I've been really happy, and that's why this is already changing because I am gonna be collaborating very soon. Already, it started with some ecophysiologists to exactly address those questions. But so I see this work as a collaborative work, and I think again this is the only way in which we're going to pull this off. Me as myself, I don't think I can do it on my own. So because it's not what I do, and but that said, so the idea that plants have this metaphysical aspect, there is no. I don't see as a either or. It's not that if we find the plants have some chemical that, just like the neurons, which there was a beautiful paper just published recently in Nature that showed, I think you saw it with the response to, in terms of in the context of defense and the response of the chemicals. So that's great science. I love it. And I'm like, yes, so I'm totally comfortable with that. And I don't see it as in conflict with other layers of reality. And that I think that what basically I am learning is that there is not just one answer to the same one question. And things happen at in multiple layers and at multiple levels. So depending where you're coming from, when I talk to the physiologists, often they just want to know just what is the mechanism. And that, oh, you should have described the mechanism before you describe the behavior. And it's like, how does that work?
Yeah,
how
no one's ever done that.
Mechanism of something that I haven't seen yet. So, but that's because some people are coming from very strict and narrow points of view. And that's okay because they might be amazing at doing those points of view, but they can't see anything else beyond those. And so I'm trying to open myself so that I can appreciate that point of view, even if maybe I don't have the skill to actually engage with it directly. So that there is a space for discussion, first of all, and through that discourse, we can open a collaboration where, great, so you got the skills, I can bring this other point of view, and why don't we combine them? And then we see a bigger picture. And as I said, this is happening, and it's going to be really exciting, I think, because the people that I'll be working with, I think that they're amazing. And so it's gonna be good. And I'm really curious just to see, I don't know if it's gonna work, but I'm curious to see where we end up.
Very exciting. So I wonder if I could ask you about the, what I think, what was one of the most exciting aspects of your work to me, which was the conditioning kind of experiments. So you present some evidence that seems to show that plants are able to learn.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? The experiment that you performed and what you take the results to be?
Yes, so I think you're referring to the peas,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, in the maize. Well, so the story is pretty simple. I think that many of us are familiar with the Pavlovian dog. And so, Pavlov had noticed that the dog would salivate before dinner. And then he added this bell, and he realized that like the dog doesn't care about the bell, but if I always ring the bell and then give dinner, the dog soon learns that, oh, the bell means the dinner is coming, and so it starts salivating even if there is no dinner around. So that was pretty much the simple, the bones of the experiment. He's like, okay, so can the plants do this as well? So can the plants learn to associate something that is totally meaningless to something that it wants, and then just the meaningless thing acquires meaning, and so the plants will respond just like the dog to the bell. So in my experiment, of course, dinner was light for the plants, and it took me a while to work out which one would be a neutral cue that the plants really wouldn't care about, because of course, again, what people maybe doesn't realize is like we're so focused on movement, and we think the plants are stupid because they don't move. But because they don't move, they are absolutely super alert about all sorts of cues, much more than animals probably. And so because they can't just uproot and go as an animal would do, so they need to really be sensitive to a lot of things all the time to know how to engage and protect themselves or engage with the environment appropriately. So that was the challenge, because I knew the plants would be very sensitive to many things. And it's like, okay, so what do I use that they really don't care about? And so I ended up settling for these, it was a little tiny fan from computers, and of course, I mean, I know the plants are sensitive to wind. And so I'm pretty sure that they would have detected the cue. But the point wasn't whether they can, I mean, the bell also makes a sound, and of course the dog can detect the sound, but it's more what kind of value the dog, or my plant in this case, gave to the cue. And so then I tested it as part of the pilot study, and you could see that the plant really didn't care about the fan. And so there was like, okay, we got something here to start with. So then what I did, just like Pablo did with the dog, I just presented the fan, followed always by the blue light, which was dinner, and done that for a few days, swapping it around, because plants are very good at like, oh, the light came from there, so I'm going there. And so I had to kind of trick the plant and say, oh, you're not going to know which way it's going to come. And so really the only thing that is going to give you the cue is if you work out that the fan is the only thing that is going to precede the light, and that's your cue. And so that's what I did. And so I did the training for about 3 days. And the training consisted in these fan lights paired up together over, the course of the day. And the plant was a little pea seedling, which was planted at the bottom. If you imagine like a Y, the shape of the letter Y. So there is a part here where, the plant is just growing and learning. And then if he has actually learned, when he hits the intersection and he has to turn one way or another, if he has learned and there is only the fan available, there is no light, and he has learned that the light is going to follow the fan, if you understood this, then the plants would go towards the fan. If he hasn't learned, then what the plant would do, which was also part of the pilot data, what the plant would do if it hasn't learned, it would rely on his instinct. And the instinct of plants is, of these plants specifically, but all plants, is to go to where they saw the light last time.
Right.
So when I did the pilot, all my peas, like 100% of my peas, went to the light where they saw the light last time, if there was no fan involved. So that was the baseline, 0% go randomly, like wherever. All of them know exactly where the light was presented last time. And that is the safest, I mean, it makes sense. It's the safest place to go. That's where it was. So it's likely that it's going to be there again. Now, when you train them and you provide this association or possibility to associate the fan with the light, then in I had two case scenario, but like between 60 and 70% of the plants actually turn away from that instinctual response, and they trust something that really didn't have any meaning, and suddenly now it does. And that it's huge, because it means that there is a decision there is a choice. It's like, these will be going to where I saw the light last time would be the safest thing to do, but I actually know that that's not the case. I know that this fan that didn't mean anything to me at the beginning, now it's got some meaning, and suddenly it's got value. So, which of course implies that the plant is not only, kind of calculating what is worthwhile and what is not, but there is a value associated to things. And it doesn't have a brain, which of course suggests that, this is possible, it can be done, this kind of behavioral expression can be done without a brain. It doesn't have neurons or a nervous system, so that's not facilitated by these structures. So what other ways the plant is doing this, I don't know. And that's the part of the more mechanistic question that I leave to the physiologist. But he's doing it. And that was for me the thing that it was like, oh my God, they're doing it. They know.
So that I mean, you describe in the book that there was a period of time where you thought that this was failing because only like half of them were going towards the conditioned stimulus.
Absolutely.
And it was kind of a revelatory moment when you realized.
Yeah, because I was in the lab, and after I'd done all the pilot studies, and then I started doing the actual experimental runs, and after 2 weeks, and again, I received a lot of emails, especially from kids from the schools, and like, oh, we want to do your experiment for the science fair, and I was like, oh no, you don't know, this is actually, it looks neat and all clean, but it's actually hard work again, and I don't see kids doing it, like it's actually not as simple as it looks. But basically, after 2 weeks of intense trialing and like training these peas, and what I found was, there is only just above half going towards the fan, which of course, if you're assuming that the baseline is 50-50, because you got 50% chance to go either way, then it's not significant and there is no result. And that thing was the first thing that I thought, and I think that was the first thing that many of my colleagues would think. And in fact, one of the reviewers for the papers was exactly his point. He's like, oh, but this is not significant. And I understood exactly where this person was at, because I was there as well at some point. And then the moment that really clicked was exactly when I just decided I was going to dismantle everything. I was like, okay, this is not working. I'm just doing this huge effort and I'm not, getting anything. Okay, plants can't do it, And so I went in the lab that day, and this is what I was describing in the book. I went in the lab that day, like really, I was just going to go there to dismantle everything. And instead, what happened was that something, as I walked in the room, which is all in darkness, something just said in my head was, I just check another time, check again. And so I looked in like, what, what is it that I'm supposed to see? And I looked in, and I have no idea. Again, that those moments, I think they occur in science all the time. But there are those moments of like, oh my God, it is working. And it is working meant, oh my God, my own bias and my own way of thinking about this has totally obscured what was actually presented. And what I mean by this is, like many of us, when we do this kind of experiment, when there is a choice between A or B, we are trained to assume that the baseline is 50-50. But my pilot data, my actual P's told me that that's not true. Like the actual P's were showing me that, no, we're going to go 100% of the time to the light. So there is no such a P that does 50-50. Those P's don't exist. They are an hypothetical baseline that doesn't exist. And this, I think, it was really important for me because, again, it just flagged the importance of look at what nature does. That overrides what your ideas are or what nature should be or should be doing. And so that is your base, and that's where you start from, not the other way around. And so that suddenly occurred to me that, oh my God, the P's are actually going 100% of the time to the light. So for them to go against that, and the majority now is going on the other way just because of a fan, it's like, this is huge. This is not just a minor change. It's like, it's a change, is a comparison between like 60-70% against zero, because none of them would ever do that. So yeah, I don't know how it happens, but it happens, I guess.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I have, so is, I mean, I think that that's pretty good evidence that there's some kind of pairing of the stimulus going on
Yeah.
between the fan and the light. And we know that kind of Pavlovian conditioning is universal amongst all animals. I mean, every kind of animal on Earth shows this kind of conditioning. So from an evolutionary point of view, I wouldn't find it all that surprising that plants are doing it as well. I mean, demonstrating it's a different issue, but I mean, conceptually, it kind of makes sense that we didn't show up. Animals don't show up magically one day. We kind of came from, built on similar things. So I agree with all that. The question I have though is that this kind of conditioning is often thought of as unconscious, that it's done automatically, kind of mechanistically. There's no real awareness that it's going on when you're being conditioned in this way. And so this showing that the plants are able to do this shows that they are processing information or something of that sort. But does it show that they're aware or that they're conscious? That's where I guess I would be a little more skeptical, because that's not the way it's typically presented in cognitive psychology. So I'm wondering what your take on that would be.
Yeah, well, first of all, for me, there is a difference between awareness and consciousness. To be aware or to be somehow be attentive to your environment is one story. And I think that this is what, you cannot not pay attention and learn associations. You are kind of, you need to be aware of what's happening around you to be able to learn. And so for me, saying that the plant is aware of the fan and the light and is doing whatever it's doing in response to it, I don't have any problem with that from this perspective. Consciousness is the C word. It's a swear word.
It's a bad word, yes.
Yeah, it is, because it's so loaded. It's so loaded from all perspectives. It's like you talk about consciousness in science, and the first thing that people think is like you need to have a brain. Consciousness is in the brain. It's like, I don't know about that. It's like, it seems such a restrictive way of seeing it. And maybe that's right, but I don't know, like, and starting from there and excluding a priori any other possibility, I find it very dangerous. So for me, neurocentered or cerebrocentered consciousness, I'm a bit suspicious. It sounds a very human way of describing things, because we have a brain. And even for our own consciousness, I don't believe that it's just there. But, that is open. I don't really have an answer. And I think that nobody actually does. We become so mechanistic in our approach, which nothing wrong with that, but it's like when it becomes too mechanistic, then look into one neuron and describe consciousness based on the one neuron. But again, for me, just from the perspective that I come from, is like, to me, I don't subscribe to a constructivist approach. I subscribe more to an ecological approach, which means that there is this relationship. So a neuron on its own is just a cell on its own. It's like if I take you away and put you in a room, you're still the human, okay? But you're not the human, the full human. The full human is you with your environment, your relationship, your food, your everything around you. So I'm very skeptical of the science that is claiming to study consciousness, not that they are describing it, but to study consciousness or trying to find consciousness when they're looking at these very reductive spaces and in isolation as well. On the other side, of course, I'm always like, oh no, when you get, I've seen it, and you can't stop it. It's like when the media in particular take your work and suddenly your plants are telepathic. Yeah. And they, and I mean, my own experiences, my personal experiences suggest me that might be the case as well, but it's not my science. I don't have any way to test that as a scientist, so I would never claim that. It's, as my personal experience, I can claim whatever I want because they're just experiences, and maybe they will inform how I approach my question as a scientist. But as the scientist, I never claimed that, and I have no way to test that. And so from that perspective, saying the plants are conscious to me is the same as saying the human is conscious. So we don't know really what consciousness is, even for ourselves. We have plenty of theories, and we somehow, again, the the westernized intellectual lineage that we come from is so insist of excluding and precluding the possibility of other systems of thinking and knowledge to come in. And so if we really were interested in consciousness, well, we should really look at all the texts written in other traditions where they have described consciousness. And instead we kind of seem like to put that aside and just subscribe to the neurocentric view at this time, which of course it wasn't always the same, you know. So for me, I rather allow the space open again. And if plants are conscious, my experience with them is that whatever it's here living inside me lives outside there too. I experienced that with my fish, and I experienced that with the plants, and I think I experienced that with every human that I meet. So if that is what consciousness is, or that how is consciousness expressed, then yeah, plants are conscious as much as myself, maybe, and anything else that is here. If that's not how we want to describe it, then plants are not conscious, but then I need to question my own description of my own consciousness too. So I guess I'm making a long story short. To make a long story short is like, I don't really know what consciousness is. I don't claim to know it. I don't think, for myself, I don't think necessarily the consciousness is a trait or something that we can measure, like here it is. It's a concept that describes a process. And but again, I'm an ecologist, so we tend to go for those kind of definition rather than the more mechanistic perspective of it. So yeah,
So,
sorry.
I mean, apart from your own personal experiences, then you would be a little bit hesitant to say that the kind of work that you've done suggests that plants are conscious.
The work that I've done only shows exactly what it shows. So it shows that plant can use sound, can emit sound. Plants learn, they have memories, they can evaluate things, they can make decisions. If that is part of the expression of consciousness, then yes, plants are conscious. If we don't want to say that, that's fine too. What I am really saying, more than consciousness as such, I'm using another C word. And that one I'm very, very happy to support and kind of, you know, sit behind comfortably, and it's cognition.
Mm-hmm.
Because cognition is an umbrella that contains all of these aspects of behavior, from perception all the way to thoughts and language. And in the middle there, lots of those processes involve learning of many kinds, memory of many kinds, decision-making, choice, and all of this. So from that perspective, plants are definitely cognitant. And then if consciousness is part of that umbrella, then we might explore it as part of the cognitive realm of plants. If it's not under the umbrella, then we'll have to find some other ways. I'm definitely very interested in the question. And in fact, with the physiologists that I'll be engaging with, we're going to see if we can find an entry point through possibly the cognitive realm and see whether we can understand what we have at play better. But ultimately, I just think that really all of this is a great exercise to understand our own consciousness, or who we are. It's always talking of the human more than the plant or the fish or whatever we are looking at, to me.
Yeah, and so as someone who's interested in the science of consciousness and, you know, spends a lot of time and even works on it occasionally, I agree that there's a kind of neurocentric approach. I think part of that, though, is that, well, there's one thing that we're sure of. Part of the reason for that, I mean, is that the one thing that we are sure of is that we're conscious. You know, going back to Descartes, this has been a line in a lot of philosophy, but I think that we can know with more certainty than anything else that we have conscious experience. In the sense that philosophers use that term, it means, you know, that there's something that it's like from my point of view, that there's an experiential point on the view of the world from here. And that I have that is not doubtable, I would say. Some people, actually, I have friends of mine who say it is doubtable. That's, I don't know, we can talk about that if you want, but I think it's, from our point of view, not doubtable. And so the one thing so because of that, I would say that the one thing that we can be pretty certain of is that brains produce consciousness. And so if we wanted to do science of consciousness, we should start where we know it is, whether it's in these other places is something that we would want to learn. And I'm open to it, by the way. I don't reject it out of hand. I slightly skeptical, but don't reject it. But I think that to do the science, though, we should start from something that is pretty much familiar and given. Would you think, is that fair, or what do you think about that?
I know that this is the main stream of thinking that we are experiencing at the moment, but I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I think that, yeah, that's cool, like, but to think that the brain produces, I don't think the consciousness is produced by the brain. I actually think it's the other way around. That the brain becomes the brain because there is consciousness. But again, even when you say, oh, I'm pretty sure that I'm conscious, and I have an experience of what it means to be like me. Well, again, it's like, but that doesn't actually define what consciousness is. It's defining an experience that you're having that you call, oh, this must be consciousness. And so I have a feeling that, to me, consciousness, which unfortunately, again, it enters or interfaces with another area of society, which, it's very tricky to navigate and not fall into that or not being put into that. But, like all the kind of new age view of consciousness, and people use the word very freely and liberally and all of that. And it becomes very dangerous because it loses meaning, if it had any. And it kind of bundles up, like you just take a bit of quantum physics, you take a bit of neuroscience, you just mash it together, and then here you go.
Exactly.
But it doesn't really advance anything in terms of understanding or any of that, which of course is very different from reading text from ancient tradition, which have done a very experiential exploration of what consciousness might be. So, there are all these different layers. And then, of course, you got the hardcore neuroscience on one corner. And so, again, I don't think when if anybody does any meditation for for a long time, you would know that, and even, the neuroscientists that have described the processing of the brain for meditators, is like, yeah, that's how through meditation, they can improve or change the dynamic of the brain, right? That is not consciousness. For me, that is what the results of a meditation practice does. And it's not that the brain has created that, but is being affected by. So to me, again, there is what you described is only half of the story, basically. There is the other half where the brain is actually being changed as much as is creating is also being created. And so there is this constant flip-flop of like, on one side is the object of or the subject of consciousness, and on the other side he creates conscious experience.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, what I see a lot in the neuroscience is like the second part is not taken into account, and so it become then very cerebrocentric.
Right.
And
well, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but you could still be. So if consciousness is something in the brain, then the brain's just affecting itself. I mean, when you meditate or when consciousness affects the brain, because I agree, it's undeniable that consciousness affects the brain, I would say. But I don't know if that suggests all by itself that it's somehow separate from the brain.
Yeah, but the thing is, totally, yeah, and I guess that's again brings us to the point of like, well, if consciousness is produced by the brain, well, surely we looked at the brain so much. Where is it? What is it?
Well, I'd say we've only looked at it really seriously for less than 100 years, but I agree with you. I agree.
If it was so obvious that the brain is producing, it's like, okay.
Where is it? Is a good question.
The point really, what I'm trying to say is like that we are actually assuming a lot here.
Yeah.
And then based on those assumptions, we are making them into like facts. And in fact, we don't really know. And that's the only fact that is actually seems to be real here. So if we don't know, it will be much safer to consider all possibilities as much as possible, all at the same time.
I agree.
And stuck into like, no, it's in the brain, And if that's the case, that's only what we are looking. And therefore, by automatically saying that, we are excluding everyone else from being conscious, everyone else that doesn't have a brain. But we could be so wrong. And also, what is very dangerous about this attitude from an environmental perspective is that by saying that, we are saying that everything else is pretty much objectifiable because they're not conscious anyway. And so we can use and abuse. This view, to me, which is a modern view, is very dangerous because it sounds very much arising from a particular culture which has driven industrialization and has taken us to the point where we are at in terms of environmental crisis right now. And I'm not saying that, oh, for the good of the planet, we should just grant consciousness to everyone so that we save the world. No, but it's like by excluding and precluding that from being the case a priori, without even really doing the science to test whether that is actually the case, very dangerous. And it's just reiterating a particular attitude that then spills over into culture, politics, and how we behave. And so then it kind of grants and it kind of say that it's okay to behave in a particular way, and it excludes us from our moral and ethical and legal responsibility towards others.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. Anytime a theory becomes unchallengeable, that's bad for science.
Yeah.
And so if you just automatically rule out the other perspective without, like you say, doing the work on it, then I think that's definitely bad. Well, I wasn't suggesting that. I was merely suggesting that what I thought of as a reason why a lot of science of consciousness starts with a neurocentric perspective was because we're reasonably sure that there's consciousness and the brain are related in us. But I agree with everything else that you were saying, that if we, without doing serious work, it doesn't make sense to exclude these other things, like plants being conscious. Although, and by the way, I teach this stuff a lot. Students are very open to the idea that plants are conscious. Whenever I bring that up, they're like, yeah, duh. And you have to try to convince them that maybe not, as opposed to convince them maybe so. But so I agree with what you're saying. What I was wondering, though, is whether the science that you're doing right now bears on that question. So what I was suggesting is that I thought that it shows that plants are way more sophisticated than we thought, but I don't see it that it's showing that plants are conscious. I'm not saying that it couldn't be shown. I was just wondering what your own view about what the work was.
No, and I totally agree with what you just said. Is like I haven't tested for that.
Right.
So of course, by opening the case of they're more sophisticated than we thought, is opening the question of like, oh, could they be? And we haven't looked.
Right, exactly. And there's been this attitude for a long time that it would be silly to look, and that I think is pernicious.
Yeah. And it's just mostly like, can we actually ask the question,
right,
like scientifically, and then we'll see. And as I said before, I'm open to whatever is the answer, but can we at least ask the question and then decide after we have checked and after we have tried, rather than a priori deciding that no, this is not the case. And it's like, well, we don't know really.
Right.
And another thing that I guess that I think would be worthwhile pointing out is that we're talking about consciousness as it's in the brain, but we also have body consciousness. We have all sorts of other consciousness types that we discuss and talk about, and so what kind of consciousness really are we talking about? And if there are different type of consciousness, if that's the case, then could it be that plants have a plant consciousness that might be really different from human consciousness, but it's still consciousness? And so then it opens up a much deeper understanding of different expression of life, rather than like this idea that to be conscious is so important and it has to be in a particular way, that if you're not in that way, you are lesser automatically.
Right.
I think that's where it really gets to me. And so I think that my work, the intent or the driver of my work is not necessarily to demonstrate, oh, plants are conscious, But actually, I think it's more important to demonstrate how amazing they are in the form of life that they are in.
Yes.
You know, like in their plantness. I don't want them to become humans. I don't want them to become animals. I want them to be seen for what they are, as amazing plants being plants. And as I think I mentioned that in the book, one thing that I learned through this is that, yeah, because they might actually invite the human to be fully human as well. You know, instead of being so contorted, is like we can actually really understand the human better through understanding others better. Because maybe, as often is the case, you know, when you have a problem, it's often useful to have someone to look at the problem from the outside, and you get this external perspective, and you're like, oh, thanks, I couldn't see because I was inside. And so maybe it's the case, this might be the case where we are going to understand better what it is about human consciousness that makes us human, by looking at others and appreciating what is that form of consciousness in the plant or in the animal or whatever. And again, it's just an idea. I just let's try that. Maybe work.
I mean, I think that anything that gets people to respect life in general more is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's really, people don't generally. I mean, yes, humans, of course, but then getting them to care about anything else is really an uphill battle.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's kind of, I know you, I don't want to keep you around forever, although I could talk to you forever, but I know your time is limited. So I wonder, we're sort of broaching these topics right now, but I wonder if and you mentioned in the book a couple of things like that, you know, industrial agriculture, or you consider to be a type of slavery for the plants.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering what kind of moral implications your work and then also your personal views about plants, because you also in the book call them people, that they're certain plant people. So that, you know, you said you didn't want to make them human, but calling them a person seems to be something, you know, I can't even convince people that dogs are people. So calling a plant a person is another step. So I just wonder if you could say something about where you think the moral dimension of your work comes in or goes.
Yeah, actually, person is not necessarily referring to that. Again, that's a very it's a very westernized version of what we, you know, what we see, how we see the world, because person doesn't have to be human. You know, there is human person, and then there is animal of other kind person, and then there is plant person or plant people. And so that's not making the plant a human, is just making it a person. And the reason why personhood is important is because we give rights to persons.
Yeah.
So it's you know, it's a kind of subversive way to like you should consider this, so that you should consider how you as the human person impinge on someone else's rights, which might not be a human person but still is a person, and it does have rights of his own just because it is here, you know. And so yeah, the work, like from an environmental perspective and how we approach nature and how we interact with nature, even you know, from a utilitarian perspective, it's an important one. And again, the solution, I don't have like a quick fix or whatever solution, and I think that if I did, the world would be already different. But you know, I think that we are still working on in general. As what I did learn from, and I don't want to romanticize them, but what I did learn from many of the indigenous people that I interacted with from different cultures, including here in the US, you know, like it's about the relating. It's not that you're not supposed to eat a plant. I'm vegan. I only eat plants, basically. So, but it's not that you're not supposed to eat plants, but it's how. It's always how.
Yeah.
If you think about your relationship with people, you know, human people, it's not so much what you say or what you do for them, but it's really how you are with them, in the relationship with them. Like, you know, how many times we say, like, yeah, this person always does these many things for me, but I don't feel their love, right? I don't feel they really care. They're just doing things, but they don't really care. So I think is that care is like, it's not so much what you do, but how you do it. And the way in which you act really reveals you as the human being, right? And so for me, it's not about like, oh, don't eat plants because poor beasties or poor planties. They have like feelings and they have whatever, they're conscious or whatever we want to say. But it's more like, come on, be proper human. Behave like a proper human person. And a proper human, a fully fledged, mature human respects life because he understands that what is seen out there is life as much as what the life that lives in here.
Yeah.
So these respect animals and with animals,
Oh,
as you
hold on. I'm
know.
sorry. You just cut out for a second. The eyeball came on. I'm sorry. Could you just re-say that again?
I'm saying that whatever we choose to do, when we are abusing, using, not caring really for the relationship, and we do this with animals. I mean, look at the abattoirs and all of the traffic of animal that is like really atrocious.
Yeah.
But we do that with plants. We do that with everything, including the actual planet. It's like we are excavating these resources, and there is no real. It's almost like we are so hungry, and there is no real relationship. And that's the thing. Is like it's about reestablishing the relationship, and then the plants can still be grown in the context of forestry, but it's how we do that. Is we care, and I think that this is the key word for me. Is like do it with care, do it that you're actually wanting to connect with this, and so when whoever it is, whether it's the animal, whether you're eating meat or you're eating a plant, you really know what you're doing. So be fully conscious. So if we are talking about consciousness and how the human is the conscious being here, it's like, well, be fully conscious of what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not conscious.
Right.
Otherwise, you are totally just a product of your conditioning, which means that you're just responding to the environment because that's what you learn to do, just like, in the experiments. So it's like, if that's the case, then yeah, you're not conscious at all. And so bring that consciousness, grow that consciousness within the relationship, and that's how you show it. And so then it doesn't matter what you do when you're eating your chicken or when you're eating your broccoli, is exactly the same. But you're doing it knowing that this is life supporting life. That's all for me.
Interesting. So, I mean, it's interesting to hear that you're vegan. I'm vegan as well. Not that it matters, but I'm vegan for what I consider to be moral reasons, because I think that the suffering of a chicken or a pig outweighs the pleasure that I get from, or would get from, eating meat. Now, of course, that would be different if I had to survive and there was only, I was living in a different world where that was the only food available. But because I'm in a Western society, food's everywhere for the most part, and I'm lucky enough to have my share of it, then I think that these kind of choices matter. So to me, the moral question with respect to plants would be, do they suffer? Do you think that they suffer? Because if so, then I don't think I could go with just the caring, because I would be very much against, slaughtering the chicken, even if it was done nicely for the chicken, because of the chicken's, suffering. So I mean, I don't know that you have an answer to this. I'm just wondering what your view about whether plants suffer. So this is something that comes up a lot. And I hear people talk about with respect to your work. It's like, someone on the internet was saying, oh, you can't be a vegan because plants know that you're eating them. They hear that you're about to come. So I'm just wondering what your view about that is, about a plant suffering.
Yeah, well, again, it's a very human concept, first of all. So when you describe consciousness, we know of our suffering and we can see the suffering of others. And the further away they are from us, the more difficult it is. The suffering of a bee or a cockroach is different than the suffering of a dog, right? Because the dog is much closer. So we can empathize with that more. So really, again, when we talk about plants, they're so alien, really. They're such weird things compared to what we are in terms of the form of life. That I think that we find it difficult to empathize on that. But I guess suffering, if we think of death as suffering, then, if plants die, then they suffer. but is death really suffering? It's like we can die in so many different ways. And so it's the same with, then again, whether it's an animal or a plant, it's exactly the same. It's like, you know, I remember when I was a child and my grandma would go to the market, she would get the chicken, living chicken, she would bring it home. And I was part of that process. Like she would just kill the chicken by cutting the neck. She would take all the feathers out and then she would boil the thing, you know, all of that. But the entire process, it was like I was 5 minutes before the chicken was dead, I was playing with it. You know, and so there was like, oh, here is the chicken, isn't it cool? Look, he's running and, you know, doing things. And then it became like, okay, this is gonna be dinner, so we're gonna go through this process. And there was I didn't appreciate that, but if I think about it now, it's like there was a kind of ritual in the process of like, okay, so now death is coming. And I remember my grandma, the best the best killing was done when it was clean, and it was just like, okay, you cut the neck here, you do it in this point particularly because the animal will die straight away. So is again, this is how we show care. I think it's like the chicken is part of, like, we are carnivores, and you know, for the most part, and we might eat meat, or you know, we might eat vegetables. And so in that process again is how it's done. I agree with you, and that was sort of part of my reason as well to become vegetarian first, and many years ago. And it was like, well, I cannot engage, I cannot be part of this kind of killing. You know, I cannot be part of a killing for the sake of it, because that's really what the industry is doing, and it's doing it in such a brutal way that's got no compassion and no caring for the animals involved. That's not human.
Right.
I'm not that kind of human, so I don't want to be part of that. So, but when I get my veggies, you know, I'm really so, especially if they're coming from my garden, those are the best veggies. You know, they're like when my plants, you know, my tomato plants or my kale comes up or my rockets come up, the arugula, it's just like you're the best rockets or the best tomatoes ever. And now, thank you so much. And when I eat it, I'm really enjoying, but there is a kind of gratitude because in a way there is this ritual. Okay, I'm gonna go to the garden and get some tomatoes now. And so again, there is a relating. And the saddest thing that I think our society is facing is when you talk to the kids and they talk to you about tuna or chicken or whatever, and they point at the tin.
Yeah.
And it's like our society has totally disintegrated any opportunity for these kids to have this relationship. So they don't even know that there could be a relationship, and their relating could change the entire experience of eating, the entire experience of food. And there is no guilt because, you know, we are animals, and as part of the system, we are consuming some and we are going to be consumed by some. So in that context, I don't see the conflict, but is how it's approached. So where the plants have pain, where the plants have suffering, is like, well, I have pain and suffering too. And if I see someone in pain and suffering, I try to relate to them in a way that can maybe soothe or ease their suffering. But suffering is part of life, and you know, maybe there is no way out. It's not that the point is not to avoid suffering or eliminate suffering. The point is like, how can we manage and deal with suffering as part of life?
Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've actually thought that I would like to go photosynthetic if I could.
It would be awesome, isn't it? It's like stuff all the shopping list. You just don't need to go there ever again.
Exactly. Just lay on the sun for 6 hours. I'm full.
You go and get some things at the market just as a treat. It's like, yeah, I'm going to eat today.
Exactly. Well, okay. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective, and one that's challenging. So I thank you for sharing that. So we've been talking for a while now. I wonder if there's anything that hasn't come up in our discussion that you would like to mention, and the answer can be no, but I'm just curious.
We covered quite a bit of ground, I guess. I don't know. Is there any other thing that you wanted to touch on that we didn't?
I mean, I think we covered all the stuff that I mostly want to talk about. I know that you're a musician and an artist. I've seen some of your art. I think it's really interesting. And you have some videos on YouTube of you playing music with, I guess you have a group.
Just friends. Yeah.
Just friends. Okay, well, it's very cool music. So is that something that you just do on the side, or are you trained musician, or?
No, I'm definitely not trained musician, and no, I don't even know how to read music, and just yeah, it just happened that I saw someone once playing, and I was so inspired, and I never played anything, and then I was like, oh, I want to play that, and that was a sitar, and so then it
Yeah, I
just
saw the video of you playing the sitar.
yeah, and it just happened that I then came across one, as you do, and I started kind of teaching myself and listening to people that I really liked, and kind of copying their style, and learning like that. And then more recently, though, I discovered the ukulele. I went to Hawaii, and I heard people playing it, not in the typical way of the ukulele, but like actually playing as if it was a guitar. And I was like, oh my god, this is so good. And so I've been playing the ukulele as well, and that one has been really fun because while with the sitar, I was trying so hard to copy. With the ukulele, I've learned how to just I can only play my own music on the ukulele. I can't play anybody else's, and it's just my own expression without having to be something else or like something else.
Yeah, that's really freeing to be able to do that.
Yeah, so that's been really amazing. And of course, I'm here in the US at the moment, and I have both. I've got my ukulele and my sitar, which is not very comfortable way to travel. Like, oh God. But and I do get asked at the airport if I'm carrying a bazooka, and he's like, no, it's not a bazooka, but okay, do you want to see it? Because and so yeah, I've got them here, and I'm always open to just improvise and play with people. If it comes, if it becomes relevant, it gives me a lot of joy, and I find it very relaxing for my mind. So that then sometimes while I'm playing, I'm there like, oh, actually now I feel inspired. I'm gonna write this down, and so the music and also painting, dancing, science, to me are just a big experiment. So they kind of mingle into each other, and they become one another, and then eventually, if I'm lucky, they turn into a lab experiment. If I'm lucky, they turn into a song or a painting. So.
That's very cool. I mean, I'm always surprised by how many musicians there are that in the world of science and the world of philosophy. There's a lot of musicians out there, people, musically interested. So I used to organize a group of people here in New York. We were called the New York Consciousness Collective. It was scientists and philosophers getting together to play music together, just, jamming or whatever. So if you're ever in New York and you want to play some music, look me up.
Sounds good. Excellent.
Yeah.
You see, that's why I carry my instruments around. It's like,
exactly. Okay.
So I think I might be coming to New York actually next year, mid-year sometime. So I'll remember this.
Please do.
Indeed, I have to travel with all my luggage again, but it will be worthwhile.
Yeah, well, you think carrying a sitar is bad? I'm a drummer, so it's
oh dear.
carrying those around. That's the worst job of all.
yeah, I can.
I always laugh when guitar players complain about carrying their gear, and I'm like lugging the 22-inch bass drum. Yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, I understand that. Well, you could always do a little drum.
Exactly. I've always wanted to play hand drums, and I've dabbled here and there, but I just never, the polyrhythms are very difficult on how to play like those drums. So I've never been really good at it. I'm a self-taught musician as well. I don't know what I'm doing. So I just listen to what I like and try to go along with what people are doing.
That's it. Exactly. Like, oh, I like this sound. I'm going to play this now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Very cool. Well, Monica, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed our discussion. I learned a lot from engaging with your work. I think it's challenging and thought-provoking and very timely. So I really hope that people read this book. Once again, that's Book the Plant for those that are paying attention. I really hope that it gains a wide audience. And I think it deserves a wide audience. And I thank you for writing it. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you so much. So I'll see you mid-year next year for some music.
Absolutely.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Ciao.